going to be about the geopolitical consequences of the battle from the perspective of Great Britain. Now we'll see all the major players and what they thought of the Battle of New Orleans and the War of 1812. Our speaker is Timothy Pickles. I consider Mr. Pickles to be one of the foremost international experts on the Battle of New Orleans and has been for a very long time. He is very accomplished in a number of areas associated with the battle, especially history of this time. He wrote New Orleans 1815, Andrew Jackson Crushes the British. He has done a number of other works as well. But maybe what's very interesting, he does a lot of consulting on films, historical films, including recently The Free State of Jones and Roots, which he informed me both parts of were filmed here in St. Bernard. But he is also trained as a gold lace man, which was most impressive to me. Is very involved and has organized the largest authentic reenactments in a number of places, including here for the recent Battle of New Orleans bicentennial, and does a number of things. He's been a good friend to the symposium from the beginning. So I'd like to present Mr. Timothy Pickles.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back speaking to you, and it's a very interesting subject, I think, the geopolitical results of the battle. In fact, when I came in, just before going into the back to get water and stuff, somebody came up to me and said, it's interesting that most historians will not speak about what might have been, because they want to stick to what actually was, and one thing leads to another, and it sort of disturbs the whole time-space continuum of what is. Well, that's where I suppose have a bit of an advantage, because I'm not actually a historian as such, I just play one on television. And I'm free to do that. In fact, with my job in the movies, I often have to do that. Interestingly, I think leading on from our last excellent talk, I think there's only one way that I can begin. And I think this is very appropriate because it gives you an idea of where Britain was mentally. The British anthem at the time was just it was just the anthem. It was not called God Save the King or God Save the Queen. And it was personalized, and it was specific to the country and its aims. And I think, being as how we sang the American anthem, please don't bother standing because this is not the current British anthem, but at the time, what the soldiers that came here would have known is, God save great George, our king, long live our noble king, God save the king. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us, God save the king. O Lord our God, arise, scatter his enemies and make them fall. Frustrate their politics, confound their native tricks. On thee our hope we fix, God save us all. Thy choicest gifts in store on George be pleased to pour and make him reign. May he defend our laws and ever give us cause with heart and voice to sing, God save the king. So that is the attitude. So what were the British thinking when they came here, and what would have been the geopolitical results? First, of course, we have to remember, always very very important to do this, and I know I go over this virtually every time I speak, but there are so many writers, even today, that don't seem to get the point that Britain was not trying to recapture the United States or the colonies. The British Empire was a mercantile empire, and they wanted land that would bring money back to England. The whole point of the American Revolution was the taxes that Britain was trying to put onto the colonies in order to get back the money that they'd already spent. They did not want something that was going to be a drain. They wanted colonies that would bring money in. Therefore, let's get rid of this idea that a British war aim was to recapture the United States. It wasn't. Not only that, it was the US that declared the war, and it was the US that made the first attack in the war by attacking Canada. So, what happened here in New Orleans was the last move in basically the negotiations in Ghent to try, as far as the British were concerned, to end the war. Both sides wanted to end it, but what would happen is that as the negotiations in Ghent were going on, if news came across the Atlantic that the Americans had won, then the American negotiators would become more hardline in what they were asking for. And if then news came that the British had won something, the British negotiators became more hardline. As we all know, this rather frustrating situation came to an end when, in the Christmas season of 1814, a treaty was signed in Ghent, and the war was ended. Or was it? Not quite. The war didn't actually end until February, when the treaty that had been initialed in Ghent had been ratified by both the British government and the American government. February 18th was when it was ratified by the United States. But what about New Orleans? What about the land where we stand? That wasn't included in the Louisiana, that wasn't included in the treaty, because at that time, the only country that thought the Louisiana Purchase was legal was the United States. The only other one that had thought it legal was Napoleonic France. Napoleon was no longer in charge of France. Louis XVIII was back on the throne, and he didn't think it was legal. The Spanish didn't think it was legal because they were supposed to get it back if Napoleon ever stopped ruling it. Of course, Napoleon being Napoleon just turned around and sold it. So, there have been speculations that had Britain won the Battle of New Orleans, they would have broken the treaty and not left this area. Actually, Britain would not have broken the treaty, but would not have left this area. So as I say, this wasn't part of the treaty. Even though there has been some strange speculation lately, it was perfectly well known that Britain wasn't going to leave because this land was going to be given back to the Spanish, who were, under international law, the rulers of this land, which had been stolen from them. So, the geopolitical consequences for Britain of winning at New Orleans would have been quite great. Had they done so, obviously, they would have secured this area. they would have been in touch with the Spanish, probably to send representatives over to be with the British while the British secured the area and to begin to look at reimposing Spanish rule. Meanwhile, this would have been a devastating blow to the United States. As you're probably aware, there was there was a group came together in the North called the Hartford Convention. Basically, they wanted to secede. People talk about secessionists and talk about the South. No, the first secessionists were way in the North, who had had enough of Mr. Madison's war. They were already selling meat to the British Army, and they wanted, of course, to be on good relations with the British so that the Royal Navy would not embargo their ports. So they were going to leave. As you are probably aware, they were actually in Washington at the time of the signing of the ratification of the treaty, and quietly folded their tents and left when they realized that their efforts were not going to go anywhere. So what would have happened with Britain? Well, of course, at the end of the War of 1812, as we know, Britain actually had quite a bit of territory within what is now the United States. Most of Michigan was British territory. In fact, within the reenactment community, there is a group of Michigan Fencibles, and it's a British unit, not an American one. They had alliances with the Indian tribes of the Old Northwest. So the immediate thing that would have happened is more British troops, because once an area has been captured, you have to leave troops there to protect it, while other troops push forward on the campaign. This had already been thought about for New Orleans. In fact, there were two black regiments, the 1st and the 5th West India, who had come out with the British troops. They were actually frontline fighting troops, but their main reason for being there was that being black, being raised out of the colonies in the Sugar Islands, they were physically able to deal with the heat during the summer. And the idea was that these would be the garrison troops of New Orleans while the rest of the army continued to move north. So, as the army moves north, what happens? Does the United States decide that this treaty that has just been signed will be adhered to, or do they decide not? Remember, Britain, under the treaty, is not going to come out of the Louisiana Territory. In other words, Britain is going to be on the western side of the Mississippi River. However, under those circumstances, they will also be reinforcing their allies, their Indian allies in the Old Northwest. So, do the Americans decide that they cannot live with the Indian nations there, and so continue fighting, or do they not? Very important for Britain, of course, because if they do, then it means more troops have to come over. But if they don't, then there's a big, big diplomatic thing going on. Remember, back then, there was no reference to the United States of America as such. It was these United States. That distinction happened at the time of the Civil War. At the time of the Battle of New Orleans, the idea was that every state was a sovereign nation which had come together to form a country. Indeed, as we've said, there were groups of people up north who had decided that their state was going to leave, as they were legally able to do at that time. So there would be negotiations. Would some states want to join the British Empire and be part of that trading, force that was going on? For the ones that stayed within the orbit of the United States, or these United States, would they wish to have trading treaties with the British? What would be the relationship with Canada? Would the people that we now call the United Empire Loyalists, who had been colonists in America during the Revolution and had to get out of the country and go across the border and were supposed to be compensated and were not, would they now have friends in London who would start pressuring the government in the United States to give that compensation, maybe even let them back into the country? That would certainly destabilize the idea of America as a single nation. The other important thing, I think, that would have affected that whole idea is the wonderful idea of nationhood that happened on the plain of Chalmette, with all kinds of different people coming together and beating the British. That doesn't happen. Andrew Jackson's not going to be president. He's a failed militia general. The idea of unity in the country hasn't really happened. That's been set aside because General Pakenham has marched gloriously into New Orleans and taken the place. Or even if he's dead, the British Army has taken New Orleans by storm and has handed it over to the Spanish. So speculating, what then happens? As far as the British are concerned, there is an immediate thing that could have been an incredible problem. As I say, certainly more troops would have been sent over. This would have meant that when Napoleon escaped from Elba, all of Wellington's best troops, not just the majority of them, all of them would be in America. Might Napoleon have won at Waterloo? I think that is a distinct possibility. Only 2 regiments, I think it was, maybe just 1, managed to actually join 2 regiments that were at the Battle of New Orleans, managed to join Wellington's army for the Battle of Waterloo, which was in June. So they left the Americas at the end of February, and by June, by forced march, only 2 regiments were able to get to Wellington, and that was on the day of the battle. They weren't there for the 4 days beforehand when he was engaged with Napoleon. Yes, there was an Austrian army and there was a Russian army marching towards him, but I think that it's quite possible that without those troops, the Battle of Waterloo would be lost. And what would happen in Europe then. Perhaps there would have been an accommodation with Napoleon. This perhaps doesn't affect Britain so much as Europe, because Britain was always looking towards the continent, towards the colonies, towards the empire, not to Europe as such. But it certainly changes the complexion of Europe vastly. How would things have happened within the United States? There was one big thing that had happened with the British coming here. As I'm sure you're aware, any slave who joined the British Army, who fought for the crown, instantly became free. This was not a bribe, oh, if you fight for us, you will be free. It was part of English law going back to the medieval times, that only a free man could fight for the king. A slave, or as they were called in Britain at the time, a villain or villain, could not fight for the king. He could work the land, he could sort of be a servant of the castle, but if you fought for the king, you were by definition free. Because of the numbers, not that they were vast, but they were significant, but the numbers of slaves that had come over to Britain during the war, there was now a significant number of freed slaves who could not go back to slavery. The British wouldn't allow it. In fact, there was a row even at the time that various American plantation owners said, under this treaty, certain of our property is supposed to be returned. Well, they're our property. While their officers were saying, no, they're not. They fought for the crown. They are free men. Most of them, of course, ended up in Trinidad, Barbados, and various things. But in fact, the Jamaica Defense Force of today has around their badge Carolina Laurel as a memory of the troops that came over with the British after they retired from America. I think it's quite possible that slavery in the United States would have ended about the same time as it did in the British Empire, which was 1833. In the British Empire, it ended through compensation. So it was just ruled from Westminster, this practice will no longer happen, and they paid plantation owners for the slaves. They were kept on as workers, of course. So, no slavery after 1833. If that happens, there's no civil war, pretty much. Because why would there be? In the South, which was very heavily royalist during the Revolution, you have cotton plantations. If they're part of the British Empire, there's now no duty on that cotton. It can just be put on British ships, which of course would have a great relationship with the Spanish, who are now holding New Orleans and all of the South Coast, because remember, they held on to Spanish Florida until 1819, and another little expedition of Andrew Jackson, and that cotton would go straight to the mills of Manchester and Liverpool, and a fabulous cotton trade happens. So, if that happens, I think that the United States, or the former United States, or whatever happens there, becomes much, much closer with the British Empire. So now let's really speculate. What happens when we get to the end of the 19th century and Kaiser Bill starts feeling his oats, and into the beginning of the 20th century, after his maternal grandmother, Queen Victoria, dies, which she does in 1901, of course, what happens when it looks like World War I might happen? I think at that point, a Britain which also includes, in one way or another, the majority of what is now the United States, or at least half of it, because the Spanish might still have the other bit, I think that is going to be a force which is too great for anybody to take on if they say at any point in the world, you're not going to do that. And if there's no World War I, there's no World War II. Also, of course, if there are no wars at the beginning of the 20th century, think of the amount of technology that Britain developed in order to fight those wars, that all countries did in order to fight those wars. Perhaps we would be flying around in dirigibles and biplanes even today. But I think there, we're beginning to get way off into the future. I think there, we are beginning to get perhaps too far down the road of speculation. So what I would like to do now, because I think I've opened a can of worms which was way bigger than I'd originally thought, if anybody has any questions, I would love to speculate even further.
And also, please repeat the question.
Yep.
Microphone when...
Absolutely.
Was Louisiana specifically mentioned in Treaty of Ghent as not being part of the treaty?
Question was Louisiana specifically mentioned in the Treaty of Ghent as not being part of the treaty? No, it wasn't. But it was also understood by everyone other than the United States delegation that it wasn't. The reason that it wasn't, I strongly suspect, is that Britain was perfectly well aware that if they said, oh, by the way, you know that that doesn't really belong to you, they weren't going to sign it. The United States commissioners would not have signed it. Once it had been signed, Britain and anybody else could say, well, you know, I can't, it doesn't really matter what you personally might think or what the United States personally might think. Legally, that colony is not yours. And so we are going to hand it over. I mean, there would not have been an argument between the United States and Britain about holding on to it, because Britain's saying, you know, this is stolen territory. We are going to give it back to its owners. And its owners are the Spanish.
What would America's reaction been? Say we lost the war in Battle of Mars. You know, we had, later on, we had manifest destiny, we had an expansion attitude. I don't think America would just step by and say, oh, well, this is how things are going to be. We'd probably retaliate sooner or later.
The question is, what would America's attitude have been in view of what happened later with manifest destiny and expanding from coast to coast, and would they have sat still for that? Because Spain was a weak power and Spain couldn't do anything. Well, I think the problem is you're looking at that situation with the benefit of hindsight. America...
I'm just saying, okay, we lose the war.
Yeah. Well, no, you are, because you are saying, we've got Manifest Destiny going for us. Manifest Destiny was brought in by Andrew Jackson, and that whole thought of clearing the Indians out and getting to the West, that's a later idea. What you have is a group of colonies that are coming together and have formed a nation. You do not have the idea of unity that the Battle of New Orleans actually gives to America. No, you don't.
They went into the Ohio territory. They went into all these others.
Yeah, but not as a nation. Not as a nation.
Not as a nation, but eventually.
But that's the thing. If it's not a nation, that's what we're talking about. It's not. There is no nation as such. There are individual colonies. Hence, the Hartford Convention, people were already talking about leaving the Union in 1815. And this is why I think it's so important. And what happened here is so important because it solidified the unity. Yes. Yeah.
The United States has invaded Canada 6 times, and we got our butts kicked out every time.
If I can mention that again from the former instructor of Marines here in New Orleans, America has invaded Canada 6 times and got our butts kicked every time. So, not me, U.S. Marine.
Let me ask you though, because
Yeah.
the United States did invade Canada. They started opening maybe there to get more land. But the reason that they were having problems with the British was because of the blockade of their ports and the imprisonment of their sailors. And so that's what is making them angry.
Actually, not so in that. The Orders in Council, by which the British government had told the Royal Navy to do that, had been cancelled. The American government knew that at the time of the invasion of Canada, that began the shooting part of the War of 1812, and the burning of York and the Parliament House there, now called Toronto, that was no longer in force. And the government in Washington could have declared victory without firing a shot. Yes?
A two-parter, please. One, could you name the 2 regiments who were at both New Orleans and Waterloo? And then part 2 is that I'm an adult. I've thought about this for a long time. You've dabbled just with your counterfactual speculation. But as to what really happened up in Michigan or wherever in these forts, did these British soldiers just go north of Canada and abandon it, or how did they leave?
As part of the treaty, the areas of the United States which were held by Britain were to be handed back to the United States, and under the treaty they left. So I'm sorry, what was the other? The two regiments that were at New Orleans and Waterloo were the Inniskillens and the Rifle Brigade. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
The first question you said, was it stolen? I didn't understand why. The British shot it, it was stolen, I can't remember.
Sorry, are you talking about the Louisiana Purchase? Oh, okay. Question about why Britain did not consider Louisiana, and nobody else considered Louisiana, part of the United States. Because France received the colony of Louisiana back from Spain under the Treaty of San Ildefonso. The Treaty of San Ildefonso specifically states two things. One, that Spain will receive in exchange the state of Tuscany in Italy, and that should France ever cease to administer, to reign over the Louisiana territory, it will retrocede to Spain. Spain never got Tuscany, and within a couple of years, Napoleon had decided France isn't going to administer Louisiana. I am going to sell it and use that money for my wars in Europe. So, yeah, the Louisiana Purchase was not legal under international law at that time. It was a deal done between Napoleon and Jefferson, and they were the only people, you know, and those were the only countries that thought it legal. So, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I was wondering, after the war, did Great Britain invest more in Canada in either troops or in any other way since they had already seen an invasion from the U.S.? Again, did they do anything to invest more in Canada as a colony?
Question was if after the war Britain invested more in Canada with an eye to invasion from the south. I don't know that they did an awful lot more than they would have done. That certainly, to use a modern term, regiments were often rotated through Canada. You know, it's certainly the you know, the nation. The nation was protected somewhat more. There's been a long-standing tradition of Canadian Army, or at the time, you know, colonial army in Canada. So that there's always been, I think, a pretty good defense. There were good troops. We had good relations with the Indians, who always fought on our side up there. So I think the idea was that we will keep a smallish garrison, a fairly large militia group, and one or two regular regiments up there. And if anything happens with the Royal Navy, of course, a big, big plus, and the Royal Navy sort of had command of the seas of the world after 1805, when Nelson destroyed the French and Spanish navies, that it would be easy to get troops over to Canada. It's not really that far away when you're going across the North Atlantic. Sorry, yes.
Going back to the treaty again, laziness and forgetting when I'm in front of a computer have played a part in not actually reading this, but I have either read or heard that there was an actual clause insisted on by the British in the treaty again that said any lands in dispute would be returned to their original owners. Is that the case, or is that just hearsay?
No, that's
Americans didn't understand the implications.
exactly. Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory is not mentioned specifically. And yes, there are clauses like that.
So it would have fallen under that clause.
Absolutely.
Having the upper hand could then say,
Yeah,
it was right here, you signed it.
exactly.
Because
Because the British, you know, didn't win the battle here.
But we signed the treaty, why wouldn't it have gone back to Spain?
I suppose because the Americans decided that they would break that clause in the treaty.
there was nobody to force it at that point.
Yeah, who's going to enforce it?
Exactly, that's why they were going into those territories like Missouri and Kansas and Ohio.
Well, no, but no, the thing is, you're putting 2 and 2 together and making 22 there. The question there was if America is going to break that bit of the clause, why won't they break the idea of expanding? And the idea is because in the first instance, the Louisiana Purchase has been revoked. There are Spanish and British troops and Indian allies of both on the other side of the Mississippi River. And if anybody tries to expand there, then they will be stopped.
And I tell you what I'm
The British troops that are there.
Sir, given the format, let's stick with questions, but right as soon as we end, we'll be able to chat together on it. Let's stick with question and answer,
Sir.
given the format.
What would have happened to Spanish Louisiana when the revolutionary fervor in Latin America took over?
Interesting question. What would have happened to the Spanish in Louisiana when revolutionary fervor in the South took over? In Latin America? Good question. Excellent question. I think that if you look at what happened in Cuba, I think that's maybe the best thing to look at. Things did not start getting out of hand there until the late 19th century. And Cuba thought of itself very much as being Spanish, not, not Latin American. And I think that in Louisiana, people thought of themselves as being French and Spanish. And in many ways had much more of an affinity with Europe than with Latin America. But it's a great question. Yes. Yes, Paul.
The British troops in the Northwest, in Canada and in Michigan and in Wisconsin, after the American Revolution, they were still there. And why? Because the United States failed to meet the terms of the Treaty of Paris. We were to give back the loyalists their property, and what did we do to them when they came back? We killed them. So, the British maintained their troops in the Midwest and in Canada, all through from the time of the American Revolution.
And indeed, I was just pointed out quite accurately that after the Revolutionary War, some of the people who were supposed to be compensated for the loss of their land did actually try to come back to the United States and were driven out, in some cases killed. And so British troops maintained things, maintained a presence after the Treaty of Paris was supposed to be enacted. It's one of the reasons why during the War of 1812, part of the secret instructions, as they are sometimes called, were that General Pakenham was to accept no, and Ross before him, were to accept no rumors from the American side that a treaty had been signed or that peace had been agreed to, that they had to wait for official notification, and they had to keep pressing the war until they heard from London. Because the experience was, these buggers are going to do whatever they can to get rid of us, and we're not going to let them do that this time. So.
You think that the British would have been willing to have maintained their troops in Louisiana for a long, long period of time? Because I agree with the other gentleman. I don't know that Spain would have had the wherewithal to hold off the Kentuckians and the Tennessees.
Yeah. Question was, would Britain have had the wherewithal to leave troops in Louisiana for an extended period of time? I would say, without a doubt, absolutely. They would have absolutely loved the Spanish to say, well, we can't really hold this. And they would say, well, we will look after it for you. Louisiana was extremely important as a state. At the time, New Orleans was the most valuable plot of land in the United States. Think of the river, the Mississippi River, not just as a watercourse, but as a main highway. Goods from the center of the country going right up to Canada can come down that river. You just build a little barge, pile your furs, whatever you have on that, send it down. It comes down to this magnificent port, and it's off into the Gulf of Mexico and out to the sugar islands that need supplies, back to Europe. Yeah, absolutely. New Orleans was an incredible, incredible prize. And I think Britain would have salivated about running it for the Spanish. And maybe even saying, do you know what? Why don't we just give you a few million escudos and we'll just take it off your hands so you won't have to worry about it.
Yes.
So,
When you said a couple of times that the United States invaded Canada 6 times, shouldn't it be correctly said that we invaded Great Britain 6 times because at that time Canada wasn't Canada but British territory?
Indeed, the question was the 6 invasions of Canada. Shouldn't we say it was 6 invasions of Great Britain because Canada was British? Yes, you could certainly say that. You could certainly say that, and that was most definitely in the minds of the British. And as I say, it's why I think had we won the Battle of New Orleans, there would have been great interest. That, of course, and how valuable New Orleans was at the time, to secure this area and make sure we had British flags wherever we could have them, and make sure that our allies were supported. Yes, ma'am.
What did they promise the Indians, Tecumseh and the Indians? What territory did they promise them?
What territory was promised to the Indians was the question, Tecumseh and that. Basically, their ancestral lands in the old Northwest. You know, what they were fighting for, the lands around Michigan. Yeah. So, you know, anything that was, you know, the old Indian territory and land, that was going to be guaranteed to them.
As a separate nation?
Yes, yes, as a separate nation. So it would have been the same as creating a new state, or a couple of new states, actually. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the presence of Pakenham's army in Louisiana and General Preble's army in upstate Louisiana all dependent on Napoleon's abdication? But up until 1814, the British had basically sent almost no reinforcements to Canada, and the only reason British forces of any substantial numbers were sent to America was because Napoleon was gone.
Right, yes, absolutely. The question, I'm sorry, was that all of it? Because I'm beginning to get...
Also, if Battle of Waterloo had not ended with Napoleon's utter defeat, wouldn't it have meant the British would have immediately evacuated everything that they had sent to America as rapidly as they could, and the Spanish couldn't have sent anything to America with the fear of another Napoleonic invasion after 1815? And there was a great press to demobilize.
Okay, now the thing is, I don't know, I'm sorry, I hope everybody got that because I can't remember all of what he was saying, so I can't encapsulate it for you, but basically, no. Remember, Britain is Britain. Britain, if things go badly with Europe, Britain as an island can deal with Napoleon. They've got a fortress. You know, there's the English Channel. So if Europe has to be abandoned, Europe would be abandoned. If Britain had a majority of troops in the Americas and Napoleon wins the Battle of Waterloo, we're not going to say, oh, well, let's pull everything out of America and save Europe. It's sort of, well, we've now got a great thing going in the Americas. Let's hang on to that, if Britain is in charge of it. Now, that is wonderful speculation, but certainly Britain has always had a great talent for working with all kinds of people. And I think we could have done it with Napoleon.
Well, Napoleon had been declared an outlaw in 1815 when he'd been restored, and he was declared an international outlaw and enemy of mankind. Could the British really have stepped back from that? Because the British had made a huge continental commitment between 1809 and 1814 in Spain.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't, we can't have a private discussion because, unless you speak very, very loudly. But no, the answer is, doesn't really matter what Britain's commitment to Europe is. There's this modern idea that nations are supposed to go around the world, nation building and making things right, and no, this is a stupid idea, and yes, we've seen a lot of it. The idea is you look after your own nation. You do what is good for your people. And if you can do good in the rest of the world while that's happening, terrific. But you do not sell your own nation down the river because somebody is doing something that somebody else thinks they shouldn't be doing.
There's a new word in the English language. It's called Brexit.
Yes, indeed. And Bob has just pointed out there is a new word in the English language, Brexit. And indeed, I agree with that. Sorry, what?
For the sake of speculation, say that the treaty was signed and Britain is holding on to New Orleans. Instead of saying to Spain, hey, we'll maintain this for a little while and give it back to you, could they have not then went to the Spanish and said, look, we know you guys aren't that strong, but we're pretty strong, we've got a good force here, we can rout these guys all over and take over the rest of this territory ourselves, and then we'll divide it up. Well, why did they not think of doing that? What prevented them from saying, let's just keep going?
The question is, why wouldn't, had Britain won the Battle of New Orleans, why wouldn't they just hang on to the territory and say to the Spanish, well, let's just hang on to this ourselves. We'll see how much of this territory we can capture, and then we'll divide it up later. I think the reason for that not being on the table is because that would put Britain in the same position that the US was in, of holding on to territory that is not theirs. I don't say that this is not something that the British would have liked to happen back then, but I think it's much more likely for them to have a Spanish presence coming in rather than doing that. But no, no, no. New Orleans was never. No, I think I explained earlier, Britain is a mercantile empire. You do not conquer land just for conquering land. You conquer land because it helps you financially. And usually you conquer it by going in, trading with somebody, and then when somebody attacks that person, you help them to overcome it. Eventually they decide that it's going to be far more to their advantage to be allied with you on a permanent basis. And basically that's how you get India speaking English today. So,
All right, one last question.
okay. Is there anybody that hasn't asked the question that wants to do that? But okay, yes, madam.
My question is going to be a simple one. All the generals that died here were sent back to England. Am I correct? Or were they buried at sea?
No, they were sent back to England. There were only two who died.
But how were they preserved? I mean, that's a crazy question.
No, I actually spoke about that yesterday at the wreath-laying ceremony down at the Delaron plantation. They were taken to the Delaron plantation, Versailles, which was British forward headquarters and also used as a hospital. This was Generals Pakenham and Gibbs. The bodies were eviscerated, that is to say, everything below the diaphragm was taken out and the viscera was buried on that land. The bodies were then put into barrels of rum. Very large barrels, and it would be a hogshead of rum about that high and about this wide at its widest point. Now, of course, Sugar Islands, you've got lots of rum, and with the Royal Navy, you pack them like that, load them onto ships, and they can go back. The bodies will be perfectly fine then to be prepared for burial in family tombs back home. Just as a little contrast to that, the French, who of course were mainly fighting on land, and Napoleon's generals, you go to France and you see all these tombs for these generals that died in Russia and so, the body isn't there. What the French used to do was cut the heart out and seal that in a lead urn, and the heart would be sent back to France, but the body would be buried on site. With the Royal Navy, the British got the privilege of, you got the body back. So.
Quickly then, as a follow-up, the other officers who died, were they buried or?
Yep, you would have to go and dig around under one of the tanks at Valero Oil. They were actually buried in the garden of the Villeray plantation, Conseil. The other ranks were stripped and buried on the field. Over the years, I've heard all sorts of things about people trying to find the burial site. We know exactly where it is. You're never going to find anything there because if you read the accounts of the time, they couldn't bury the bodies deeply. In fact, they only had a little bit of earth put over the top of them. Of course, you start digging down, get 3 feet, you've got a pond. So every night it rained, bodies popped up. Eventually, the British sort of walked away from it. A few weeks after the battle, there was a flood of the Mississippi River. The bodies came up. Some of them were swept into the river. When Monsieur Chalmette came down to have a look at his house, well, one, of course, Andrew Jackson had burnt it, but the whole of the property was peppered with naked, rotting bodies. And when obviously they would get slaves to clear them out where they could. When the weather warmed up, it's a free meal for snapping turtles, alligators, anything else. That's where the British are. And so, as I like to say, this whole area is peppered with British dead. Everywhere below Line Jackson, it's got British blood, bones, you name it, because it was scattered around by the animals, the river, and just what's happened in the years since. Thank you so much.
Right, present this to you, be
Oh.
recognizable, but look inside later.
Thank
And,
you.
As a tour de force.
Oh,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much. Fantastic indeed.
Whoops.